What is going on, guys? Welcome back to the Boardroom Podcast, where we help you stay calm, change lives, and have business on your terms. Now, I have a guest with me today, Hector, who specializes in using podcasts as a channel to grow your business, grow your authority, nurture your audience, and things like that. So it's pretty cool that we get to be having somebody who specializes in doing podcasting as a means to grow and accelerate business growth. So Hector, how long have you been in the podcast game? Like, how long have you been doing this for businesses?
We started originally marketing podcasts back in, our first one was 2017, right around there is when we first started working with podcasts.
And how'd you guys get started? How did it even become a thing? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, I guess going one step before that, I had a sales organization that I was leading kind of in the brick and mortar space before I got into the online space. And when I jumped into online marketing, I tried to do everything under the sun to try and make money. So I had a Facebook ads agency for real estate agents and realized that there was a bunch of reasons I didn't want to go down that path. We had a branding agency where we were doing websites and logos and realized, didn't want to go down that path. So we just kind of were pivoting. And throughout this process, we had a podcast reach out to us and say, hey, Instagram just released this new feature where they are allowing us to post videos on our page. Can we use our podcast? They were doing a Facebook live stream, because that's what I was doing before. I had done, a couple of hundred Facebook lives and built up a YouTube channel before. So they knew that I could do that. They said, hey, can we take that video, that long, 2-hour video that we do, and make these little clips of them and put them on our Instagram? And we're like, sure, we could do that. Because it wasn't as easy as it is today, where there's a bunch of apps and AI and all that stuff. So it was like right when Instagram released their first, first video. And since then, we had another podcast reach out to us and say, hey, can we do that and do that? And we ended up becoming a podcast marketing agency, which is where we got our start. But eventually we realized that if we wanted to grow the show, the best way to do that was to improve the editing and the sound. And then once we started, getting our hands in that, we realized that if we could help the show get off to the right start and get it off in the right direction and improve the premise and help the host and dial up all of those things, well, then now you can really have a real asset for a business that frankly goes beyond sponsorships or goes beyond just kind of the basic monetization thing, where, we have one of our agencies, their podcast, the podcast does thousands of downloads a month, but it's also the number one driver for clients for their marketing agency. And so it's become this really great tool that, for me, I used to have to explain what a podcast was to people, and I would say like, oh, it's like Netflix for, your radio. And obviously it's become this kind of phenomenon since 2020, went down. But now I get excited about it because executives specifically, a lot of people who have built up their expertise over the last couple of decades, it's now possible for them to kind of come from behind the curtain and to show that expertise and to use that to build their company's brand, to build their personal brand. And
it kind of happens like organically. If you're talking about things that you're really good at on a podcast, you're not really necessarily bragging, but you get to just organically showcase, that what you're talking about, that you got experience and you've got you've reached some pretty incredible milestones.
Well, yeah, especially for industries where it's not complicated is not the right word, but we have one client where it's a very complex industry, right? Just frankly, from all the way around. And the sales cycle there is, sometimes a couple of years for people to really understand what the business can provide, for them to be able to match up and to be able to identify the problems and for their typical sales process, with all of the time and the meetings and the people that it used to require, sometimes that would get stretched out over years. Well, all of a sudden this company starts a podcast, and within a matter of weeks, they have people reaching out to them, and all of the questions are answered. All the trust has been built. They're able to understand the methodologies, everything is there, and people can do it at their own pace. And so they're signing 6, sometimes, close to 7-figure contracts in a matter of weeks. And it's so, when done the right way, businesses and then obviously executives, the people on the show, can really see a lot of benefit from it.
Yeah. So it's like an accelerant that condenses how long it would normally take to get a prospect to a point where there's enough trust to where they're willing to do business with you. That's awesome. So you were in the podcast game before it became a trend. How has the podcasting changed over the years? What are some like significant like changes that you've seen since you started doing this thing?
Video is obviously a big one of them. And I don't know if it's an obvious thing, but when I got into it, video, it was a question. Are you going to do video or not? Now it's almost not a question. It's like, how can you do video and at what level can you do video, and not every show has to do full length production, multiple cameras, it doesn't require all that. But I think that video, at least in some sort of a component, even if it's just in the clips and the shorts that are put out on social media, just that awareness, and then also the trust that's be able to build, when someone's looking at someone's face, it's hard to replace that, or the value of that. There's so much upside in it that it almost like doesn't make sense to not.
Yeah. Do you see that going anywhere anytime soon with like the advancement of technology and,
It just came out today that YouTube is the number one podcast discovery platform, I think they have 31%. Spotify has something like 20 something percent, and then Apple was coming in at like 19. And so it's already today, the numbers have already flipped. And if I'm going to bet on anybody out of those three, I'm betting on YouTube.
Yeah, I can see that trend continuing, especially because it's one thing to listen to a podcast, and it's great to listen when you're kind of like passively traveling somewhere. But if it's a good enough podcast that you can watch it on video, a lot of people would rather consume visually than just listen to it on the audio.
Yeah, and I think the stat was 31% of Americans use YouTube, 31% of American podcast listeners use YouTube. And essentially the reality of what I've seen happen is that people will discover podcasts on YouTube because it has a great discovery engine. It's got a great, algorithm to match people to what they're interested in. And then they'll go to Spotify and listen, or go to Apple, or go to wherever their podcast is. And so being on YouTube is kind of the gateway into, sort of the media ecosystem.
That makes sense. Because I was looking on your website, I think you've done a ton of different types of podcasts. What are like the extreme ends that you've been on when it comes to podcast productions? Purely business, or has it been fairly...
The not business, but interestingly enough, what we do is we serve industry specific shows. So, I think about one show for us that's a growing popularity. It's called Grow Everything. It's a biotech podcast. It's out there, like the stuff that they talk about and the things that we're doing and growing and making out of all of the. I mean, it is like it's a pretty wild podcast, but it's also put on by a marketing agency, and that serves that industry. And it's a vehicle for, yes, they're able to promote some of their clients. Obviously, they're able to get clients from it, and then they were just the host was just at a conference with Brian Johnson. I don't know if you know that, Live to a Million or Never Die guy who's all 17 years old or whatever, that guy.
Yeah.
Well, he was speaking at an event, and so it was in that space, and she was just walking, to that event, and someone came up and recognized her, and they're like, "Hey, aren't you the person with the, the podcast?" And, wanted a picture and whatever. And so she's it's happened a number of times at these industry events where she's become this mini celebrity. And then obviously that opens so many doors, that gets you so many connections, that gets you so many meetings, that if you have a product, a service, or something on the backside of it, it turns into real revenue. But going back to it, a lot of our shows are designed like that, where we've sort of over the years stumbled into the playbook of how do we come into an otherwise pretty boring niche and create this really valuable show that makes the business who puts it on look amazing too. Another one that we're doing is in the cybersecurity space and the industrial cybersecurity space. And so these are the people who are helping protect like the factories and like the warehouses of the, Fortune 1000 companies. So these massive buildings, right? And some of the stuff that they talk about on it, like I'm generally interested in a lot of different things. Even me, I'm like, whoa, this is really deep. But once again, that was actually the business that, was able to cut their sales cycle, and they were able to 10th it right? Like, they were able to go from, to take it 90% off of their sales cycle in some instances. And so that's the alignment, right? That's sort of the common thread is, can you come into an industry and provide real value and then use it as a way to sort of generate business?
Yeah. That kind of leads into the next thing I was going to ask you about is like, what do you feel are the most important points that really make a podcast work? And I think you hit one of them is providing real value, right? Like you got to have something that people want to learn more about. Do you think it matters if you necessarily niche down, or is it more about like the value that you're creating for the audience that are listening?
It's always like, it depends, right? And I think it really depends on is this for the business or is this for the founder of the business? Because I worked with one of my good friends who went through an exit, right? Was going through a really big exit, not a big exit, but a sizable exit, an 8-figure exit. And about a year or two before the exit, started hosting one of the podcasts that we produce and really leveraged that show into whatever was next for him, right? Because a lot of founders, they come in and they have that exit and then they kind of have this soul searching moment where they don't really know what to do, or they've kind of got to start over or that sort of thing. And so it was like a really good transition piece. And the reason I say that is like, it's got to be clear, what is the intention of the show? Is the intention of the show to build the brand of the business? Okay, that's one playbook, right? That's one type of offense, if you will. Is the intention of the show to get our foot in the door with ideal clients and ideal prospects and, really drive the pipeline? Okay, that's a slightly different playbook, right? Like that offense looks a little bit different. And so going in with the intention of what do we want to get out of the show? And then I would say right behind that is knowing, okay, who are we serving? Who are we serving and what are they interested in? Because once you know that, you can start to create content and you can start to interview and find the people who are going to get those people, to tune in and listen.
That makes sense. So on that side, you probably have a formula or some type of playbook that you guys will typically deploy to figure out what makes sense based on the goals of whoever show it is, right?
Right. Yeah. I think there's like two main paths when like, if we want to simplify it as much as possible. There's either the thought leadership path or there's what we call like the pipeline path, right? And the easier one is the pipeline path. And what's nice about a podcast is, at least for the time being right now, there's still a celebrity-esque factor to coming on and being a guest on a podcast. The chances of you reaching out to the top 1% of thought leaders, decision makers, key stakeholders in your industry and getting them on your show, even if you have a brand new show and don't have any episodes, it's very high. Right. I mean, people are very surprised by the type of guests and the level of quality, whatever that sort of means, the talent of guests that you're able to get on a podcast, especially when we're talking about, industry specific stuff. I'm not talking about getting on Brad Pitt or Will Smith or those types of celebrities. I'm talking about like industry specific celebrities that, a lot of times the people in our spaces, there is a sort of celebrity to the industry, whether it's the speakers or the organizers or the presidents or whoever those key stakeholders are. If you all of a sudden say you have a show and you have a show that's for their industry, most of those executives are going to come on, or if nothing else, they're going to have someone on their team or, in their C-suite or so. You can get in your foot in the door with these businesses that would otherwise not give you the time of day. And so, all the way down, I mean, some of the shows that we're working with they're having the most popular companies in the world, companies that everybody would recognize, reach out to us and say, hey, we want to be on your show. And in some instances, they're even paying, to come on these shows, because once you get past that point, now the media platform actually becomes its own asset in of itself on top of it. So that's the first part is the pipeline and interviewing guests. And we've got sort of a follow-up playbook that we follow, that we use to engage them, social media and the repurposing of the clips and, posting on LinkedIn and tagging them on Instagram and all those sorts of things to really make it sort of feel like an event for the guest. Like all that sort of stuff is part of that playbook. And then on the other side is sort of our thought leadership, where we're just trying to put ourselves in the middle of that industry. We think of like what we call like a hub and spoke model, right? Where we think about all of the different stakeholders. And so going back to that cybersecurity show, we're interviewing managers and we're interviewing, founders of companies, and we're interviewing developers and technologists and all these different people who kind of come together to serve this industry. And in doing that, you can kind of quickly put yourself at the middle of it.
Yeah, that's really cool, man. So for somebody who's listening to this and just kind of hearing on that, and they're like, well, shoot, I need to start a podcast. Right. What are a few things, that you find to be challenging for, new podcasters when they're starting to kind of get into the space?
Obviously, the initial part is like, it's a little techie, and it's much easier than it was, 6-7 years ago when I was sort of venturing into it. And it was even easier then than it was 6 or 7 years before that. So like the space has gotten much, much easier. Now, with that being said, do you need to find a good mic? Do you need to kind of get a camera? Like there are some like sort of basic boxes to check. Like, do you need to find a software or somewhere to record, or like these sort of basic things that, in my experience, the more successful someone is, the less likely they are to be able to do that on their own. Like, interestingly enough, right? I work with some extremely, extremely successful people in the business space. I mean, multiple exits, the billions in revenue that they've accounted for. And all of a sudden you start asking them about what mic they want to use or how to stand that. Like it's a totally different thing.
It's something they never had to consider. And so it's like,
you put a camera on and things change, so there's that part of it, which I think is okay. That's one thing to wrestle with and for people to kind of figure out. Once you get over that, the second part is like, it is a lot of different small pieces, in the sense that like there's, in our sort of weekly production flow, we've got like 23 different steps that involve a variety of different people. And if you try and have one person do it, it's really hard for that person to be proficient at writing, good show notes and making a good graphic and editing a good video. And like it's really hard for one person to do all of that at a really high level. And so you end up having someone that you have to pay a lot because you need a really high skilled person, or you end up managing a lot of different kind of freelancers and contractors, one guy to do the video, another person to do the graphics, someone else to write, someone to post, a VA. And so like where we've tried to come in and sort of like eliminate all those people, where you get one high quality contact person that can do sort of like get everything done and everything comes out at a really high level. And so that becomes an issue too, because there's just, you got to kind of figure out a lot of different things. And of course there's Google and YouTube, but if you're running a business, and especially the people that we work with, any big business of significance, there's just,
the last thing you want is more things to think about and more people to have to manage.
Right.
Right. So if you're a business owner, which is like everyone listening to this podcast, right? Whenever, if you get to a certain point, the return on your time to figure something out versus coughing up the money to hire somebody who already has it figured out.
The challenge is I can't tell you how many people I've had who go, you know what? I just want to figure this first part out and then I'll come back to you. And I'm like, okay, I know, like, fine. If you want to go through that initial learning struggle to realize how valuable it is to have something, like, okay, that's going to make my sales pitch
they end up
easier.
Coming back 3 months later in the same
it's even sooner. It's sooner. But the hard part is that they spent the most time. You know what I'm saying? Like that was the most time, least return. And it's like, just so you could feel the pain in that. I'm like, all right, go torture yourself. After that, it's like fun,
Yeah. Okay. So I want to shift gears a little bit about what you guys actually do, because you started your company called Amplify, right?
Correct.
I like the play on words with the way you guys kind of like spelled the name. I don't know if there's any meaning behind it, but I like the fact that you guys are
Well, it's easier for trademark. There is an Amplify Media, and I'm from LA, so that's like where I was born and raised, and so it was a small nod to my Southern California roots.
Okay, very cool. You guys started Amplify Media with, from what I'm recalling, the website with the goal of just simplifying podcasting. What some of the services are you guys providing in order to help entrepreneurs simplify what it is for them to launch a podcast and get it to be successful? Because you mentioned there's a lot of moving parts, but for the entrepreneur that works with you guys, it's actually not. For them, there's no moving parts outside of just connecting with whoever their account manager or project manager is, right?
Yeah. And most of the time, like we have one client, I'm thinking in particular, they're actually our first agency client that we were doing their full production. We should launch their show. He hops in, he records the interviews, and like, that's it. Like that is the extent of his involvement in the show. We come up with the show titles, we write everything, we post everything, we follow up with the guests, like it's his all he likes to do is just connect with people. Like that's what he does and enjoys. And, he's been able to get his foot in the door with companies and people that he would never be able to get, involved in the time with. And he's been able to parlay that into, book deals and, contracts for his consulting company and all these sorts of things. And he just gets to talk and show up. And that's where his magic is. And that's where we like to keep him. So we'll take that. We'll do the sound design. We'll kind of make it sound good and polish it up. We remove a lot of the like what's called filler words, or we'll go through and really polish up the conversation to make, most importantly, we found is that it makes the guests sound so much better when you're able to clean up all of their ramblings and clean up all of their false starts. And we've had guests come back and say like, hey, like you really made me sound great in that edit. And also that puts the business who produces that show in a really good light, And so that's a big part of our process is sort of making it sound really smooth. We add music and all that sort of stuff, but then we also are responsible for publishing everything. So we'll get it up to YouTube and we'll get it up to Apple and Spotify and do all the posting and publishing. And then a lot of times we'll even follow up with the guest I mentioned, because we found that giving them all of the assets and media and pictures and graphics and links, and with AI now we'll write them a little blog post or an email or sample caption and stuff, so they can just copy and paste stuff, and all that is sort of part of it. So that way the host or the business, they really get to focus on whatever aspects, that they want to.
Yeah, I think that's awesome, man. So one of the things that I remember seeing is, I don't know if it was you exactly, but I remember seeing, I think it was you, was like, you want to help people bring out their geniuses, right?
Yeah, it's my email signature. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So I was like, I want to make sure it was you or maybe somebody else. Maybe it was your assistant that sent that. But is there any story behind that, or any client example that you worked with where you're like, this is why I do what I do?
It's been innate for me. I always wondered what it was about podcasts and what it was about media that I got so excited, and why, after doing websites and Facebook ads and PPC and SEO and trying really all, tasting all of those things in digital marketing, what it was about content that like really lit me up. And when I get into, you can hear like when I'm just talking, like I talk about podcasting and it revs me up. There's something inside that is fueled by that. And when I reflected on it in my own vain way, I love that I'm able to share my expertise or experience. And so there's that part of it. But also I realized that most of the times when I built a business, it wasn't about like making me the star. Like I'm totally fine not being like the pro, like the wrestler. I'm fine being the Rock. Like I'm Vince McMahon, although his personal antics are like you can think of whatever as an individual. As a business owner, I've always been inspired by the Walt Disneys, the Ted Turners, the people who were able to create IP. They weren't necessarily the stars, but they were able to create stars out of other people. And when I think about our production company now, we've got about almost 30 shows, and all of I can't say all, but so many of the hosts who have really leaned into it and kind of, been consistent and all the sorts of things. And I would say a large majority of our shows were able to really bring out their genius, where all of a sudden within the industry, within a certain amount of ecosystem, like this person becomes a somebody. They're able to go from nobody knowing them to all of a sudden people going, I see you everywhere. And not only do they see you everywhere, but now all of a sudden they understand who this person is and what they have to offer. And it's like that for me is the real value of podcasts and sort of what we can bring through, all the production.
Now, for those who are listening, the idea of hosting a podcast week after week could probably feel a little daunting, maybe even exhausting. What are some strategies that you recommend to just kind of help keep the podcast going strong over a long period of time?
Yeah, the easy thing I would say is to not think that you have to host a show every single week. I mean, we have plenty of shows that do them in seasons. And in the same way that a TV show comes in, is hot and popular for a series of weeks, they squeeze what they can out of it, and then they go and they get ready for the next season. I mean, that is a perfectly viable option for a podcast. It's not going anywhere in the same way that someone can watch a season of Game of Thrones today, or they could have watched it when it was dropping. It's all the same. And so people can relieve themselves of that. Are there advantages to putting out something consistently every week? For sure. But it's not the only way to do it. So in the instance that someone is like, well, I do see the value of being top of mind. I do see the value of, really that's what it is can you stay top of mind for somebody so that in an industry like a lot of B2B spaces where it's less about how good of a salesman are you, and it's more about, is it the right timing and then
the
thinking
relevance
of you.
Is it relevant to me right now?
Right now, right? And if it's not, can you stay relevant enough, or can you stay top of mind enough to when it does become relevant that you're the first person they think about? And so what I would say is there's two sort of things that we recommend to our hosts when they're getting started. The first is, and it's usually based on kind of the individual's personality. The first is to record every single week like it was a standing meeting. A lot of business owners sort of have standing meetings with either team members or accountants or coaches or whatever, every other Monday or every other Wednesday. Like if you could just make it every Wednesday or every other Wednesday, whatever it is, or every Monday, there's a set time in your calendar where recurring, Tuesdays you're going to show up and Tuesday afternoons you're going to record. If you can do that, that's going to be really helpful for you to just build that rhythm, build that habit. And then, we say, if you can do that and get 2 recorded each time you do that, well, now when life happens or travel happens or events or conferences or all those sorts of, normal things that come up in business, well, all of a sudden you're not scrambling. Because that's what ends up happening is people, they go really hard and they realize that it's a lot of work to keep up with the pace. Is really, really, it's a lot. And that's
why I have a job. There's nothing wrong with getting ahead of schedule and kind of batch.
On one of our shows, we have we're recording this now at the end of August. We have episodes recorded through November. We've also we haven't recorded any of those in the last few weeks because we had so many in the queue. And that was a little bit of an exaggerated sort of example. But it's also evergreen content. So it's not like it's going to change in between now and then as well. The other option is what we call batch content, which is, there are certain individuals who the idea of them having a recording time in their schedule every week is like one of the most anxiety creating things for them. And so for those people, we're like, okay, pick one day a month and block off the whole day. Those people, they usually can do all right, on a Monday, I'm going to record all the episodes, or I'm going to batch all my videos, or whatever it is. That sort of thing is sort of the other path. And so those are the 2 things that we recommend. And I got one more thing because I know I'm going on over, but the last thing is we look at it in numbers, 25, 50. What we found is that, and actually it's not me, but there's some statistics where something like 80% of, maybe even 90% of podcasts will fail within their first 7 episodes. So it's okay, there's the first one. But what they found is that 90 some odd percent of podcasts will fail within their first 25. So we're essentially, if you can get to past your first 25 episodes, you've hit your stride a little bit, right? It's kind of going to the gym. And that's what we found is 25 episodes, 6 months of doing it. So if you can do that, okay, that's step 1. All right. We're not going anywhere. Step 2 is people always ask, well, when can I start monetizing, or when can I start thinking about that? We think about that as 50 or 100. If you've got a significant audience, okay, maybe at episode 50, you can start to look up and go, hey, maybe there's some partners or people that might want to, pay to collaborate with us. And then definitely by episode 100, you can start to look at, not necessarily, I actually recorded a whole episode for my podcast about this the other day, about getting sponsors, because sponsors is put in a certain bucket. If you all of a sudden look for partners for your show, now all of a sudden it's a different thing, right? When someone doesn't sponsor the Super Bowl, they partner with the Super Bowl, and it allows them to charge a lot more money, and it also allows them to be on the buses and be on the signage and be on all the different sort of things that are just outside of the game. And so in the same way, we like to think of help our sort of clients think about their shows as media properties at that point, not just a podcast.
That makes sense. Now, got a couple rapid fire I want to hit you with before you go, because you've been dropping some value. How do you measure success of a podcast in terms of like, revenue or
clients?
Just do it based on clients and revenue.
Clients signed, like at the end of the day, because we used to track downloads and we used to track charts and rankings, and frankly, it doesn't matter. It doesn't correlate to business. So it's like,
it's like when you start doing the podcast, do you have specific ways that you'll track revenue that can be attributed to the podcast? You have like unique links that you put in show notes and all that good stuff. How are you guys attributing that?
Usually
or you're tracking
not.
General lift in business.
Generally not. What we're trying to figure out, what we're trying to figure out is where did they come from? How did they hear about it? What was different? The businesses that we serve, almost invariably, there's an instance where the client is on a phone call or some sort of call with the prospect or lead, right? I mean, most of the people that we're serving are selling higher ticket services. And so generally the sales process involves, sort of a one-on-one call. And almost invariably do they mention, oh yeah, I listened to the podcast, or I saw the podcast, or I saw, like almost invariably do they mention that the podcast was a part of their process. And so that's really all we can make sure of, because otherwise, if you are just trying to track it like an old school sort of funnel, where you're trying to track the lead through what landing page they hit, and then the emails that they open.
It goes too complex.
Unfortunately, it's not the way that it works with podcasts. And usually, in a B2B sort of space, it's not always how it's put together either,
Yeah, that makes sense. So last thing before we close out, we definitely got a little over, but I don't think the listeners are going to be upset about it. Reflecting back on like an entire journey, what would you say has been kind of like the most rewarding aspect of what you do, and what is next for you and Amplify Media?
Yeah, so two parts to that. The first is that now people, whenever I tell people like, oh, I have a podcast production company, they go, oh, that's so cool. Like now it's cool.
Get it.
Now, and like at parties and stuff, I have to stop myself, because people they're like, so how does it work? And what do you do? And it's like, so it's very, there's that part of it, which is like vindictive, I guess, in some cases, because for so long people were like, you do what?
What the heck is a podcast?
I remember I moved in next door to my neighbor, and he heard what I was doing, and it was back in right after the 2020, right where things were opening up. So it was this podcast was still this thing. And he was like, are you sure I want you guys to stick around. Are you sure you want to keep doing that? He's like trying to talk me out of it. And I'm like, no, Jeff, like, I appreciate you. It's good. Like, we're going to be okay. So there's that. And then the second thing I would say is like, I have a 4, she's going to be 5, and a 6-year-old boy. And the fact that I was able to be around through their sort of, while they were kids and babies, and be present and be the father that I wanted to be. And could we have made more money, and could, were there some sacrifices? And like, for sure, all of those. But I look at the relationship and the connection that I have with my kids, and the time that I get to spend with them, and the lack of time that other parents get to spend with their kids. And I'm just like, damn. So I think that for me has been the most rewarding. And, what's next? I see over the next few years, our goal is to build it into something, sizable to sort of, package up and sell. But in the meantime, we want to be the best podcast production company for executives. We're well on our way, and on the clients that we're serving, we're getting to serve some of the best of the best in the industries that we serve. And, we continue to plan on doing more of that.
Yeah. Now, where can somebody find you if they've been listening and made it to this point? Like, how can they get in touch with Hector?
Yeah, I try and post as much as I can on LinkedIn and Instagram. So at @Hector_podcast is most of my handles, or on LinkedIn it's Hector Santiesteban. And then all of the info about our services and sort of what we do, and you can kind of book some time with me, is on our website. And that's Amplify Media, AMPLAFY media.com.
Awesome. Well, man, Hector, it has been a joy having you on. You've been just a wealth of knowledge. I've learned a lot just from this. And I'm sure everyone who's listening, if you don't have a podcast and you're just terrified at the idea, or you feel overwhelmed at the idea of having a podcast, reach out to Hector, have a conversation with them and see what it would be like to, if it makes sense to work with them. Because at the end of the day, being an entrepreneur, the last thing you want to do is put more on your plate. So how do you do it with leverage, right? And you get leverage by having as little input and getting more output for the little input that you have. And that's exactly what his crew does. They allow you to turn your podcast into something that's high leverage, little input from you, and they take care of making sure all the outputs come as a result of this. So Hector, thank you for jumping on. For those that were listening, thank you. Go ahead and like and subscribe and share if you find this helpful. Till next time, stay calm, change lives, and have business on your terms.